The plan turns now from kidnapping Lincoln to killing him. And what I want to do is I want to go through the list of conspirators. They're all on your ID sheet. Now, what I would suggest you do, you take notes however you want, but all the names are right here. You might just write next to the names on the ID sheet, because I'm not giving you a whole bunch of information, but it's totally up to you how you do it. So we're going to go through these conspirators. These were the people that in the end were considered Lincoln assassination conspirators. Obviously we have John Wilkes Booth. He was an actor who basically lived out of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. We know a little bit more about him. Very famous actor, very well-known actor. Might be, I'm not into the movies as much now, but might be the Brad Pitt of today's movie theater. Very popular in a lot of movies. People could recognize him, although they weren't movies, they were plays at the time. So, you know, he was kind of a movie star, so to speak, at that time. The first conspirator we'll talk about was a fellow by the name of John Surratt Jr. And during the war, he was a Confederate courier. And what does a courier do again? Messenger. Messenger sends messages. So he was a Confederate courier. And he was only involved in the kidnapping plot. Only involved in the kidnapping plot. Okay? So we got John Surratt Jr., who was a Confederate courier and was only involved in the kidnapping plot. The second conspirator was Samuel Arnold, and he was a Confederate soldier, and he was only involved in the kidnapping plot. There's going to be a difference in the end, as you can imagine. So he was a Confederate soldier, only involved in the kidnapping plot. Our next conspirator is Michael O'Laughlin. He also was a Confederate soldier and also involved only in the kidnapping plot. Michael O'Laughlin, a Confederate soldier, only involved in the kidnapping plot. The next conspirator was George Atzerodt. He was a Confederate blockade runner. What does that mean, Carter, if you're a Confederate blockade runner? There's a couple of ways you could run blockades. Remember they blockaded the entire southern coast at the start of the war, and then they shut out Vicksburg, for example. A blockade runner would be someone that would run the blockade and bring in food and medicine and supplies to people in need. And Vicksburg might be the best example. And George Atzerodt was a Confederate blockade runner. He was involved in both plans, both the plan to kidnap and then eventually to assassinate the president. So he was involved in both kidnapping and assassination. The next conspirator was David Herold, who was simply a friend of John Wilkes Booth. And he also was involved in both plots, both the kidnap and assassinate. David Herold, simply a friend of John Wilkes Booth, and he was involved in both plots, both to kidnap and to assassinate. The next conspirator might have been the most brutal. His name was Lewis Powell, sometimes referred to as Lewis Payne. If you hear Payne, it's the same guy, but we'll go with Lewis Powell. Okay? And he also was a Confederate soldier, but he was trained in guerrilla tactics. What are those? Guerrilla tactics.
It's like a bunch of like quick hits and runs.
Hit and run, and kind of brutal. Borderline terrorism that we would consider today. Okay, he was a brutal man. He was a Confederate soldier that they had trained in guerrilla tactics, and he was involved in both plots, to not only kidnap, but also to assassinate President Lincoln. And you'll hear a little bit about him. He was a brutal son of a gun. The next conspirator was Edmond Spangler. And he was basically a stagehand that worked at Ford's Theater that was a drunk. He was a drunkard stagehand who worked at Ford's Theater. A drunken stagehand. And what he did is he assisted Booth in his escape after the assassination. Okay? He was kind of there and ended up getting himself involved by helping Lincoln escape after the assassination.
So he was at the wrong place.
Well, not so much. I mean, he knew what he was doing. So I would, Julie, that's a great question. He knew what he was doing, so I wouldn't say he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We haven't gotten to that person yet. He knew what he was doing. He didn't have to do what he did. So, but he basically was a drunken stagehand, and he helped Booth get away. Okay. The next one was Mary Surratt. I'll have to tell you a little bit about her. Interesting lady, Mary Surratt. She was simply a Southern sympathizer. Okay, and the mother of John Surratt Jr., the first guy we talked about. So she was simply a Southern sympathizer and the mother of John Surratt Jr. Now she ran two different businesses. She ran a tavern or a bar in Virginia, and she also ran a boarding house in Washington, D.C. Okay, so she ran a tavern in Virginia, and she also ran a boarding house in Washington, D.C. And a boarding house is where people came and rented rooms. A big house with lots of bedrooms, so to speak, and they would rent out the rooms. So she ran a tavern in Virginia and a boarding house in Washington, D.C. The problem with her was that Lincoln and the conspirators used both her tavern and her boarding house for meetings to talk about the kidnapping and then eventually the assassination. And Mary Surratt's boarding house is still very visible in D.C. I wish I had thrown that at you, but we didn't know that, right? So it's in D.C. on F Street. I mean, that sounds stupid, but you kind of know how they went ABC the streets. But anyway, that's how she was involved. She also would later provide Booth a pair of binoculars after the assassination. So they meet and scheme in her places of business, and she later will give Booth a pair of binoculars after his assassination. So she willingly allowed him to have the meetings and willingly gave him binoculars, and was the mother of Surratt, who was involved in the kidnapping plan. So she's in. Okay? Now, Julie, my dear, we get to the man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was Dr. Samuel Mudd. Dr. Samuel Mudd. And he was a Southern doctor, and he definitely was a guy that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what did he do, Dash, that got him to be a conspirator?
Wasn't it that Samuel Mudd stumbled into his office wounded, and he just helped him because he saw a wounded dude?
Pretty close. His business was out of his home. He had a farm, and during his escape, Booth broke his leg. I'll give you, when he jumped off stage after shooting the president, which we'll get to. And he simply stopped, he and one of his accomplices, which we'll get to later, stopped at the Mudd residence, and being a doctor, he fixed or splinted Booth's leg and would be held accountable for helping the fleeing assassin, well, harshly, for how much he was involved. So there are Booth's conspirators, including him, what their position was, so to speak, and what their contribution was. So, kiddos, let's get into the assassination of President Lincoln. It'll be not quick, it'll be detailed. The assassination of President Lincoln. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about April 14th, 1865. And we're going to start in the morning with President Lincoln. So when we talk about the assassination of President Lincoln, we will start on the morning of April 14th, 1865. And we'll start with President Lincoln's day, how it's going. So what do you think he's doing in the early morning of April 14th, 1865?
Eating smoking.
What?
Eating smoking.
Very good. He's having, I don't know if he's eating oatmeal, but he's having breakfast with his family. Yep, so we're starting with that. So morning of April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln is sitting down and having breakfast with his family. And he was very pleased because his oldest son, Robert, had come home to visit the family, and he was involved in having breakfast with them that morning. His oldest son, Robert, was home. And guess where he just came from? See if you can pull this off. Where'd Robert just come from? What just happened a few days before that?
Civil War.
Yeah, but what happened specifically just a few days before April 14th, 1865, on April 9th?
Surrender about that.
Right. He was a personal aide to General Grant, and he was back from Appomattox Courthouse, where he witnessed the Confederate surrender by Robert E. Lee to the Union. So Robert was home, the president was happy to see his oldest son, who had just returned as a personal aide to General Grant, and he was just returning from witnessing the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Also at breakfast was their younger son, Tad, T-A-D, and Mrs. Lincoln, who was still grieving over the loss of their middle child, Willie. So at breakfast was Robert, the oldest son, Tad, the youngest son, President Lincoln, and Mrs. Lincoln, who was still grieving over the loss of their middle child, Willie. Now, Willie had died 3 years earlier at the age of 11 of typhoid fever, and Mrs. Lincoln was having a very difficult time getting over that, as I can't imagine what that would be like to lose a child. So, Willie had died at the age of 11 of typhoid fever in 1862, and Mrs. Lincoln was still grieving. The historians say that the reason she had so much trouble getting over the loss of Willie is that Willie was the most like President Lincoln, most like him personality-wise, and so Mrs. Lincoln had a difficult time with that because the boy was so much like her husband. So they have breakfast. It's a nice day. And at 11 a.m. that morning, President Lincoln has a cabinet meeting of his cabinet members at 11 that morning. And two notable people that were at the cabinet meeting were General Ulysses S. Grant. He was there after the surrender at Appomattox. He had returned to Washington. He was at the meeting. And also Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward. So two notables at his cabinet meeting were General Grant, who had returned from the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, and Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward. Now, we talked about this guy a while back. You may or may not remember him, a guy by the name of William Seward. And the reason Frederick Seward was at the meeting instead of William Seward, who was the Secretary of State, is that William Seward was recovering from a carriage accident and was bedridden at his home. So what Lincoln did is he appointed Seward's son, Frederick, to work in his stead while his father was recuperating. So William Seward, the Secretary of State, who normally would have been at the cabinet meeting, was not there because he was recovering from a carriage incident or accident, and his son, Frederick Seward, who was serving as Assistant Secretary of State, now would be filling in as Secretary of State until his father recovered. Anybody know what a carriage is? Horse-drawn carriage. So evidently he was getting a little wild and crashed his carriage and hurt himself bad enough that he was bedridden at his home. Well, after that cabinet meeting, the President and Mrs. Lincoln decided they would attend a theater performance at Ford's Theater later that evening. So the decision was made after the cabinet meeting by Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, so to speak, that the two decided they would attend a play performance at Ford's Theater that evening. And Lincoln invited several guests, including General Grant and his wife. So the Lincolns invited several guests to join them at the play that evening, including General Grant and his wife. Now this is a little bit of interesting information because Grant was unable to accept the president's invitation. He and his wife already had plans to leave town and spend time with their children. Would have been interesting if General Grant would have been there that evening, but he was not. What's that? No, I don't know what it'd been interesting. We'll get to that. That's a very good, but we'll get to that. So Grant's invited and his wife, among many other guests that the Lincolns invited, but Grant and his wife declined the invitation because they're going out of town to visit their children. Well, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on April 14th of 1865, President Lincoln meets with his Vice President, Andrew Johnson, at the White House. At 3 o'clock that afternoon of April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln meets with Vice President Andrew Johnson. Then at 4 p.m., he and Mrs. Lincoln decide that they're going to take a nice carriage ride around the city. It's a nice day. They decided they would take a nice carriage ride. So at 3 o'clock, he meets with Vice President Andrew Johnson. And then at 4 o'clock on that day, he and Mrs. Lincoln decide they're going to take a nice carriage ride because it's a nice day out. Mrs. Lincoln later reflected on how giddy, G-I-D-D-Y, how giddy her husband was that day. What's it mean if you're kind of giddy? Happy, relieved, loss of stress. And her point was he was really feeling good that day because the weight of the Civil War and the surrender had lifted his shoulders. He could see progress going to be made in restoring the Union. And she just referred to him as really giddy that day, really happy, really relaxed. Now back to their evening plans. The Lincolns had invited 13 guests to attend the play that evening, including, as I mentioned, General Grant and his wife. They had invited 13 guests. Of those 13, only 2 people would accept their invitation and attend the play that evening. So the 13 they invited, only 2 people are going to accept this invitation. And those 2 people are Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. So the 13 people, including General Grant and his wife, that the Lincolns invited to accompany them to the play performance in Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, only 2 accepted. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Now you might wonder, well, who's Henry Rathbone and why would he get an invitation from the president? He was a survivor of the Battle of Antietam during the Civil War and did some heroic things there, and so Lincoln invited him. So he was a survivor of the Battle of Antietam, and he was a military officer. Now I think this will start to ring a bell for you a little bit more, Miss Anderson. Let's see. The theater performance that was scheduled for that evening was entitled, she didn't even look at her sheet, Our American Cousin. So that was the name of the play production that would be played that evening at Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin. And this particular play would star an actress by the name of Laura Keene, who also produced this soon-to-be infamous play. So the play would star actress Laura Keene.
Is it Laura or Laura?
Oh, do I have K? Oh, it's Laura, L, sorry. Laura Keene, who not only would star in the play, but also produced the infamous play. So, let's go back in the morning and see what John Wilkes Booth is doing today. Okay? So we're back at 10:30 in the morning. And what happens at 10:30 in the morning is John Wilkes Booth arrives at Ford's Theater to check his mail. As I mentioned, he kind of lived out of the theater, and that's where he got his mail every day. So at 10:30 that morning, he goes there to check his mail. It was delivered daily to the theater for him. And when he's there, he runs into the theater manager, a fellow by the name of Henry Clay Ford. Okay, he's the theater manager. And Booth comes in and gets his mail, and he runs in to theater manager Henry Clay Ford. And Talon, what does Henry Clay Ford tell John Wilkes Booth? He informs Booth, hey, guess what? The president's coming to the play tonight. Kind of a big deal when the president comes. So Ford was so proud to inform Booth that President Lincoln would be attending the play that evening. Now let's... What?
He's a theater owner?
No, he was a manager, but I'm sure he was related somehow. Now, this is what you got to keep in mind. This whole time that Booth has this kidnapping, then killing plan, he is waiting for the right moment. When he finds out that the president is going to visit the play that evening, this is when he makes the decision, this will be the day. Okay? So all this time he's been waiting for an opportunity. And he finds out, and he now will have his chance to assassinate President Lincoln. Happens on this day because he goes and checks his mail and gets that information. Now, why would it be perfect for Booth? Because he's a very popular actor of the day. He's recognized by many in the acting profession. He isn't going to be questioned appearing at the play that evening. He'll be able to get close enough to the president to assassinate him because nobody's going to question wherever he goes in the theater, right? Because they know him, okay? So all of a sudden he goes from, when am I going to do this, to today's the day, okay? So what does he do after he finds out this information? At 12 noon, he rents a fast horse from a nearby stable so he can prepare for his getaway that evening. 12 noon, he goes to a local stable and rents what he believed was the fastest horse, a fast horse, to get away.